Alright, so for the second part of my visit to the OBX, we are going off in search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke. And in fact, my visit to the OBX changed my entire perspective on this. Now, to the uninitiated, basically anyone who didn't grow up in the US in the 1990s or before, the Lost Colony of Roanoke is one of those old American tales, like Pocahontas intervening to save John Smith's life, or Molly Pitcher taking up her husband's cannon, or Lewis and Clark guided by the brave Sacagawea to chart the West, or titans of American business and ingenuity becoming leaders of the free world. Now, in the traditional telling of this tale, after a few mishaps, a couple of failed attempts at colonization of the area, and shall we say complicated relationships with the local Native Americans, John White landed on Roanoke Island with 115 colonists on July 25th, 1587. John White's granddaughter, Virginia Dare, was born there just a few weeks later, first English person to be born in the New World. And that's where the present-day county, Dare County, gets its name. But after that high point, it all pretty much went downhill from there. You see, the colonists, mostly middle-class Londoners, had no idea how to fend for themselves in this strange new land. And as those previous attempts at colonization had pretty much put the English on every side of local conflicts between the Native Americans, the neighbors were understandably a little sus. So after just about a month, White did the brave leadership thing and hightailed it back to England to get resupplied. And he arrived just in time for a little war with Spain, which is actually very much alive in the consciousness of the British people today, because that marked the defeat of the Spanish Armada.
My loving people! We see the sails of the enemy approaching. We hear the Spanish guns over the water.
So in preparation for the hostilities, Queen Elizabeth forbade any ship from leaving port, intending to use any and all for the ongoing war with Spain. White did get permission to launch a relief effort in 1588, but unfortunately the captains of those ships decided to go a pirate instead. And after a little incident with the French off of Morocco, White once again returned to England empty-handed. Well, as you'll note from the map, Morocco is in a little bit of a different direction than North Carolina. And White returned the second time just in time for more war with Spain. So yeah, not much happened over the next few years. But finally, in 1590, once things had died down with Spain, White did make it back to the colony, only to find the place totally abandoned, stripped of all possessions, boats, etc., deserted. However, he found the letter CRO scratched into a tree, and investigating further, he had discovered that the colonists had built a defensive palisade with the full word Croatoan spelled on it. Well, White knew what this meant, having instructed the colonists to leave a secret token of their destination should they decide to leave the colony. And Croatoan, that was actually the name of the local Native American tribe, as well as the island where they lived about 50 miles to the south of Roanoke. Today it's known as Hatteras Island. And that's right next to Ocracoke, which we covered last week. But here's where the traditional narrative begins to break down. That last fact, that White knew definitively what this meant, is often left out of the history books. When I was a school kid, we learned that that CRO inscription, obviously hastily written, probably meant Croatoan, but that it was scrawled as the colonists were being attacked or taken into slavery by the Indian tribe. Or there's the suggestion that the Spanish may have attacked and carried the colonists off. After all, we do know that the Spanish were surveilling the place from records in their archives. Philip II of Spain sent the governor of Florida to do just that in 1598. And the Spanish did leak out some information as a ruse that they were thinking of attacking the colony. However, that was really just to confuse the British. There are no records that they took any action on it. And that's it. Poof. The colony just disappeared. And hence it became known ever after as the Lost Colony of Roanoke. However, this kind of begs the question, why didn't White ever go in search of the colonists? After all, his daughter and granddaughter were among the missing people. Well, what happened next seems super sus. Supposedly after a storm, one of the ships, Hopewell, its anchor snapped, and they decided that it was too dangerous to investigate the islands further and would be better to head down to the Caribbean for the winter instead.
Welcome to the Caribbean, love.
And by the way, this was only August. And now there were two ships on this investigation, the Hopewell and the Moonlight. And the Moonlight at this point decided to head back to England, which makes perfect sense, right? Which is exactly what the Hopewell wound up doing after another storm ruined its Caribbean vacation. And this served the purposes of Sir Walter Raleigh, the boss of this whole endeavor, just fine. You see, he was granted governorship of the Carolina Territories, but his deed was time limited. He had to establish a colony by a deadline. However, with the colonists missing, not confirmed dead, there was a bit of a timeout on that deadline. So rather than launch another investigation only to find the colonists dead, Sir Walter Raleigh pretended to make a few attempts to land on the Outer Banks on his way to South America through the 1590s, where he was looking for gold.
You greedy dirtbag!
Hence, the colony was not lost. It was abandoned. For greed. Traditional narrative shattered. And not long after, in 1603, Raleigh was implicated in a plot to kill the king James I, Elizabeth's successor, and he found himself a little bit beheaded. Well, that ended that, but the colonists were not totally forgotten. Captain John Smith of Jamestown, of Pocahontas fame, even made a few attempts and inquiries to see what happened, putting out feelers with the local Native Americans and launching a few small expeditions in search of the Roanoke colonists. In the very early 1700s, explorer John Lawson visited Hatteras Island, and he hypothesized that the locals were actually descended from the colonists of Roanoke, given their gray eyes, English cultural imprint, and their claims that their ancestors were white. And in fact, the site of the Roanoke settlement became a bit of a tourist attraction over the years, even visited by the 5th President of the United States, James Monroe, in 1819. So the romantic myth of the lost colony gained currency, and the alternative that the colonists integrated with the Native Americans, well, let's just say that wasn't particularly politically helpful over the centuries as the American expansionism pushed westward right into the Native Americans, and there was pretty much periods of constant warfare. And then in 1937, a popular stage play popularized the lost colony story, and hence that became part of the American consciousness, giving rise to the school textbook version. Now, I know what you're probably wondering. Fine, this is all interesting history, but this is an archaeology show. Where does the archaeology come in? Well, I was recently visiting Hatteras Island, and I came across something I didn't expect. The Lost Colony Museum in Buxton, one of the villages on Hatteras Island. The museum, a passion project of local resident Scott Dawson, totally changed my perspective on the whole story. It's where I first heard the real details behind the textbook version. Although there's some history, the main event at this museum is the Archaeology, which strongly suggests that the colonists of Roanoke integrated with the Croatoan on Hatteras Island. You see, Scott is a native of the region, descended from a Dutch sailor who got marooned in the Outer Banks in the 1600s and intermarried with a local Croatoan Indian woman. And he was passionate about finding the true history of the lost colony, busting through the traditional narrative myth and finding some actual material remains of the colonists. Encouraged by previous limited investigations and convinced that there were clues hidden in the shell middens on the island, and those are found throughout the coastal southeastern United States, Dawson decided to found the Croatoan Archaeological Society. Made up of interested members of the local community, some of them of native descent like Scott, the Society's goal is to tell the true story of Croatoan, now known as Hatteras Island. And they enlisted Professor Mark Horton, an academic archaeologist then with the University of Bristol and now with the Royal Agricultural University, to run the excavations. Mark is a not infrequent guest and host on archaeological TV programming in the UK, and one of his specialties is historical archaeology, that is, archaeology supported by some semblance of historical record, which is exactly what we have with the Lost Colony. So the digs went on for 6 years, from 2009 to 2015, led by Dr. Horton and assisted by Scott, as well as locals from the Archaeological Society and graduate students in archaeology. The site they chose was in the woods near Buxton, near some previously excavated sites by Professor David Phelps of East Carolina University, where he had dug after Hurricane Emily exposed some previously unknown middens in 1998. Phelps' findings included a gun lock that dated from the 1500s, a gold signet ring from a slightly later time, and plenty of brass and lead droppings from bullets. And as we've discussed before, many archaeological excavations are never published, and I believe Dr. Phelps has since passed away, so the archive from his digs resides at East Carolina University. So while the museum has some photographs and information about those digs, it actually has the findings of Dr. Horton's digs, so you can see the real deal in person. Now, there are definitely some interesting remains of the Croatoan, and you can learn more about their traditional way of life, but what really steals the show here are the artifacts that suggest the colonists integrated with them. There was this piece of the hilt of a rapier from the 16th century. That's a fancy gentleman's sword, and this is not something that would have been used as a trade item. It would have been held onto as probably an heirloom. And this Nuremberg token, basically used in Europe in the late 1500s and very early 1600s as counters for accounting purposes. Now, it matched 3 others that were found previously on Roanoke Island and another one found on Hatteras in the 1930s, creating a connection between these 2 islands. There was this Tudor rose, symbol of the Tudor monarchy, which would have been way out of style by the 1600s when the Stuarts took over, and it seems to have been repurposed here as a horse bridle. Also found were bits and pieces of guns whose parts had been mixed and matched, some copper bits and bobs that were repurposed into fish hooks, and some pieces of glass that predated the 1600s. There was also the remains of some ironworking that Native Americans at that time would not have been capable of, as well as some pieces of pottery from the 1500s. Some of these items, particularly the 16th century pottery, the Nuremberg token, and the Tudor rose, would not have been in circulation in the 1600s, and it's not like they're things people would have held on to either as valuable keepsakes. And this is what sets this site apart from other so-called survivor camps, where items were found that could have been from the Roanoke colony time, but also just as easily could have come from Jamestown. Moreover, with the reworked items into fish hooks and the mix and match gun parts, the impression one gets is of hand-me-downs, basically of the colonists and the Native Americans they integrated with not being able to fully replace and repair this stuff over time, and hence having to discard it in middens. It all sounds very convincing to me, especially when combined with the historical evidence from John White and others.
The more primary sources you read, the more you're like totally convinced. You're like, this is a no-brainer.
However, just like with Phelps's work, none of the excavations from Horton and team have been published, so it's a little bit difficult to judge at this point. Now, this museum is not a big place. It's really just one room. However, our host, Scott Dawson, is extremely engaging and passionate and very generous with his time. So honestly, I easily spent over an hour in that one room. Now, this whole story has gotten a lot of attention, including a 2015 feature in National Geographic and a 2022 special on HBO Max, now available on Amazon Prime. However, I have to admit I was not actually aware of any of this before. In fact, it was Chester Lynn, that local historian on Ocracoke, who just mentioned it to me offhand. And as we were passing by on the one and only road that goes through Hatteras, we just decided to stop. And boy, was that a good decision. Now, given that this subject matter is of national importance, this small community archaeology project has made it big. But like I always say, most of them don't, but they work on fascinating stuff. There's probably plenty of local archaeology going on around you, you just don't know it. Anyway, I love these sorts of stories. This little community archaeological project has made a real contribution, and hopefully it will continue to do so. We'll hear more about it from Scott Dawson, as I plan on interviewing him in the near future, so stay tuned for that. However, if you find yourself heading for some fun in the sun in the Outer Banks, make sure to stop by Scott's Museum in Buxton. You're definitely not going to regret it. And even if you're staying put, try to find some opportunities to engage in local archaeology. I'm sure they need all the volunteers they can get. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.